While in retrospect, it seems slightly absurd that Al-Qaeda could destroy American civilization and in effect overthrow the US government, you have to remember that certain people are very prone to hysteria in a crisis. The emotional fallout of 9/11 had a big impact on these types and seemed to validate their worst fears and the doubts of even the most committed libertarians. In those dark days right after September 11, 2001, the anti-war movement, and by extension, the libertarian movement, contracted considerably. Against the overwhelming tide of pro-war opinion, that giant tsunami of self-righteous belligerents, very few could stand, but stand they did, confident in the knowledge that once the emotionalism of the moment washed over them, they would be proven right in their opposition to the war party's agenda. In the meantime, however, the warmongers were in the saddle, and they used their political preeminence to take us a long way down a road we have since had good reason to regret traveling. If we can liken the 9/11 attacks to the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor and analogize the capitulation of all too many otherwise sensible conservatives and libertarians to the America Firsters who decided at that point to pack it in, disband their organization, and abandon their long-standing opposition to overseas interventionism, then we can see how this was replicated in our own day. Insofar as its methods are concerned, intellectual and even physical intimidation and shameless fear-mongering are among the weapons in the war party's arsenal. And in this sense, very little has changed since World War II. Today, however, in terms of its composition, we are talking about a horse of a very different color. As America teetered on the brink of entering World War II, Charles A. Lindbergh gave a fateful speech that did more damage to the America First movement for peace than all the propagandistic efforts of the pro-war groups he named in Des Moines that day. In his oration, the great aviator and American hero sought to define who and what had brought us to the point of no return, and I quote, "The three most important groups," said Lindbergh, "who have been pressing this country toward war are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration. Behind these groups, but of lesser importance, are a number of capitalists, Anglophiles, and intellectuals who believe that the future of mankind depends upon the domination of the British Empire. Add to these the communistic groups who were opposed to intervention until a few weeks ago, and I believe I have named the major agitators in the war in this country," end quote. Now, as Hitler was rampaging throughout Europe, bent on enslaving and exterminating the Jewish people wherever his minions met them, it is no wonder that a great many American Jews were plumbing for war, and Lindbergh said as much. However, where he crossed the line and gave the war party a very effective bludgeon with which to beat him and America First was when he went on to say the following, and I quote, "Their greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government," end quote. Now, I agree with John T. Flynn, a member of the America First National Committee and a leading light of the old right, who was furious upon hearing Lindbergh's remarks. In a letter to Lindbergh, he wrote that although the responsibility for the tactic of smearing opponents of war as anti-Semites should be brought home to Jewish leaders, quote, "This is a far different matter from going out upon the public platform and denouncing the Jews as war makers. No man," said Flynn, "can do that without incurring the guilt of religious and racial intolerance," end quote. In his speech, Lindbergh protested that "I am not attacking either the Jewish or the British people. Both races I admire, but I am saying that the leaders of both the British and the Jewish races, for reasons which are as understandable from their viewpoint as they are inadvisable from ours, for reasons which are not American, wish to involve us in the war, end quote. In spite of this very bad faux pas, however, Lindbergh's speech is a rather perceptive, albeit flawed, analysis of the war party, its methods, and its various components. If we take it as our baseline, we can see that here is where the analogy between World War II and what the neocons call World War IV begins to diverge. In our own time, the foreign interests described by Lucky Lindy no longer include either the British or the communists. And as for the Jewish people, in their majority, Jews overwhelmingly oppose the Iraq War and no doubt view a potential conflict with Iran in the same skeptical light. The war party today is an amalgam of elements that include foreign interests, notably the pro-Israel lobby, which has taken the place of the Anglophiles as one of the chief pillars of the interventionist leadership. Smearing peace advocates as anti-Semites has indeed been a recurring theme of the new war propaganda, especially when war critics point out that this campaign to transform the Middle East through military force has served Israeli and not American interests. What is notable, however, is that American Jews have not been taken in by this propaganda and remain opposed to the militaristic foreign policy of this administration, perhaps more so than any other single group in America. The war party is now reduced to its core elements. They don't have the over 60% of the American people who think the Iraq war was a mistake, and they certainly don't have the Brits who recently threw out their prime minister on account of his subservience to the war party's agenda. Even a number of neocon intellectuals, such as Francis Fukuyama, have jumped ship. The war party today consists of three main groups: the ultra-nationalist faction of the GOP that profits politically from our policy of perpetual war, the military-industrial complex that profits economically, and Israel's lobby in the US, which uses its considerable leverage in American politics to keep us embroiled in the Middle East. The power of the ultra-nationalists in the GOP is rapidly waning, as is the appeal of the cult of George W. Bush. Blowhards like Giuliani and Sean Hannity and Coulter types, to the contrary notwithstanding, the red state fascist ideology underlying this political trend has really been discredited, not only by the war, but by its own inner contradictions. The Republicans are supposed to be the party of smaller government, lower taxes, and individual rights. And yet, as Ron Paul has pointed out, these people have lost their way. We have Republicans spending like drunken sailors, no tax relief in sight, and a party that views individual rights with the same jaundiced eye as Torquemada and the Spanish Inquisition. The party of individualism, free markets, and the right of the people to remain free of government coercion has been transformed into an organization whose main platform plank seems to be the glories of groupthink, the alleged right of big oil companies to exploit foreign interests on the American taxpayer's dime, and the moral necessity of torture. That some Republicans remember a time when this sort of bizarro world conservatism did not rule the roost is doubtless a factor in the decline of the ultranationalists, and is fertile ground for Ron Paul to garner support and make the case for a return to ideological sanity. The libertarian critique of neoconservatism is no longer restricted to the people sitting here in this room. As Victor Gold, a longtime GOP operative and deputy speechwriter to Barry Goldwater, put it in his recent book, Invasion of the Party Snatchers. Great title.